Matthew 7, and I want to set the stage for our lesson this morning, by just reading the passage, Matthew 7, 1 through 5. I want to read it, and then I want to go back and make some comments related to the text itself before we dive into some of the meaning of it. Because there's a few things in the text I think that are so important that we need to make reference to, and I made a couple of notes. Okay, Matthew 7, and we're going to go 1 through 5. Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when all the time there's a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the plank out of your own eye, and then you'll see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Wow, pretty strong metaphor. Let's talk about the text here for a minute. It's interesting in verse 2 that he says, this is literally, and with whatever measure you measure, it will be measured to you. He uses the word measure 3 times right next to each other. And so you get the impression, just by the way that the sentence is arranged, he's concerned very much about how people are trying to measure others. So with whatever measure you measure, it will be measured to you. And we're going to talk about that dynamic in just a little bit. Then there's something else that's fascinating. This is in verse 3. You know, it talks about the beam that is in your eye. The way the Greeks would talk about it is kind of hyphenated phrases. So that literally, here's what the phrase sounds like. It's the in your eye beam. This phrase in your eye comes before the definite article and the noun beam. So it is the in your eye beam, which is a fascinating way to describe this. It's not just any old beam, it's the in your eye beam. Okay. And usually writers, when they would write something like that, it's almost as if, well, think about the way when we write something. When we write something that we really want to emphasize, we'll take a highlighter, or if we're writing to someone else, even if you're composing email, I've done this, you'll either take your cursor and scroll over the letters and make that red so it really stands out, or you'll put underline or whatever. Sometimes if you send a text message, I was reading this, so if you send a lot of text messages, be careful. Because it said if you send a text message and it's in all capital letters, the other person thinks you're yelling at them. And I was unaware of that. I don't know how true that is, but that's interesting. So if you send a text message, don't do it in all capital letters. People think you're yelling at them. Now, so in this way that Matthew's going to write this thing, this in your eye sort of beam, it's almost like he's taking a quill pen and he's underlining this. And he really wants to talk about this because this is really a very important concept. And then I want to throw out another thing that's just amazing to me. And I think I was sort of aware of it, but rereading this morning, it really hit me. When he says in this passage, how shall you say to your brother, let me cast out the speck from your eye? This word cast out is a very strong word. It's not the idea of just throwing something, balo. It's ekbalo. It's with the strongest amount of energy casting something out. And here's the irony of this. I want you to think about this. When someone comes to you and says, I've got something in my eye, would you help me get it out? Your approach generally is very tender, and you'll tell them, now hold still, look up at the light, and the other person says, be gentle, because it hurts, So we've all been through that dynamic. The word that Matthew uses here is to cast out the beam. It's an opposite action of what you would ever think of somebody doing if they get close to your eye. Now, one translation says pluck it out, and that's not strong enough. It's almost like grabbing it and yanking it out so that you don't care about the person. See, this is what's interesting. You don't care about the person, you just care about what you see and how you think you can fix it. Oh. Ooh. I hope none of us have been there. Surely not. Okay. So that's a very important concept, and we'll come back to it as we look at this particular passage. Yes. This is down in verse 5. Which says, okay, you hypocrite, and I'm going to come back to this in a moment in our lesson. It's interesting, it's not the you plural. A lot of times when Jesus is speaking in the Sermon on the Mount, he's speaking to the crowd. And he'll use what we call the you plural. Something like in East Tennessee we say, all y'all, okay? All y'all, pay attention. Well, instead here, it's the singular you. And I think the reason Jesus uses the singular, I get this picture. He's looking at the audience, at every single person that's listening, and it's almost as if he uses his finger and says, you hypocrite. It's a pretty powerful way of getting his message across. And it's almost like he said, I'm talking to every single one of you listening that are guilty of this. Whoa. So that's what's going on here. But he says, okay, every single one of you, you hypocrite, cast out the beam in your own eye. Now we're going to look at this principle. He's saying, okay, you're wanting to go over and yank out something of somebody else's eye because you know what their problem is and you're going to fix it. He says, why don't you just spend a moment and take that same action and use it on your own eye? So how do you, have you ever been stuck in a situation where you're trying yourself, nobody else is around, you're trying to get something out of your own eye? That's a tough thing to do. And so he's saying, okay, if you're gonna act this way, start off by doing it to yourself that way. And it's almost as if, here's what I was thinking about. Because he's going to say, with what measure you use, it's going to be measured to you. This is almost the golden rule in reverse. It's kind of fascinating to think about that. Okay. Now he says, if you do that, cast out the beam in your own eye, then you will see clearly to cast a speck out from your brother's eye. And this idea of seeing clearly, it's not just, this is what struck me about it. The whole Sermon on the Mount is about Jesus trying to teach people to see more clearly what the kingdom is about. And what I hear Jesus getting close to saying, and he almost says it here, the reason so many people can't see the kingdom of God working is because they're so busy trying to fix other people. Like, whoa. Whoa. So, if I'm going to be involved in kingdom work, I have to attend to myself, ask God to help me be the person I can so that I can see more clearly. Not to see your fault. See, it'd be interesting if we could engage Jesus in further conversation on this. I could hear him say, now, yeah, you want to see more clearly, but it's not so that you can run around picking out other people's faults. To see more clearly how God is working in the world and see more clearly who you are before God, how God made you, how God wants to use you in people's lives. This idea of seeing more clearly gets right at the heart of the Sermon on the Mount. And it's by no mistake that I think Jesus is saying this here, because he's going to start winding down the whole sermon here. So he's going to start making some powerful points. Well, let's move on then. What is judging about? These are the points we want to look at real quick. The command not to judge, and he says, in the same way that you've measured, it'll be measured back to you. And the metaphor of the plank and the speck is what we might call a ridiculous paradox. And we're going to look at it a little bit closer. And Jesus says, how can you say this? How can you say to your brother, you hypocrite? Okay, the command not to judge. We've talked earlier toward the end of the Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus says, I'm sending you out into the world with the good news. And I want you to make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them all things I've commanded you. And one of the most fascinating things as a study exercise is go back in the Gospel of Matthew to start with and look at all the direct commands that Jesus gave to his disciples. This is a command. Do not judge. If you want to be a disciple of Jesus, if we want to be this morning, we have to take seriously this command by Jesus. Disciples do not judge. Really? Ouch. I thought disciple could be much more simpler than that. This command in the Sermon on the Mount really gets at the heart of it all. Don't judge, and this is literally what Jesus says, don't judge so that you will not be judged. He makes a direct link, and I don't think we in our minds have made that direct link. We can count on it. If we judge people's motives, and we'll talk a minute what judging actually includes, when we're involved in this, we can count on it. We're going to receive it back on ourselves. That's a direct cause and effect. And don't judge so that you will not be judged. And I said, when he says in the same way, this is kind of the golden rule in reverse. And what measure you use, it's going to be used on you. The idea of what goes around comes around. You ever heard that saying? What goes around comes around. Okay. So what measures do we use to judge others? Before I go on, I'll just raise that question. What's your answer to that? What measures do we use to judge others? Appearance. Probably where it starts, doesn't it? Appearance. And when you say appearance, what are some of the judgments we make based on appearance?
Is what we would do.
Okay. So you judge what you see that they're doing, whether or not you would do it. What else? What other judgments do we base on appearance? Well, think of, yeah, Nancy?
Sometimes we don't judge on appearance, we judge motives, and that's not.
Okay, that's another. Let me come back to that in just a second. I want to deal with appearance, and then let's go with Nancy's on motive. Appearance. If somebody's not dressed the way that we think they ought to be dressed, do we judge them? Okay, not like we used to. Oh, so you're saying used to was worse. Okay, okay. But isn't it interesting that just on appearance of clothing we may judge someone?
Is that we see ourselves as being perfect.
Yeah.
And so they don't meet our standards.
Yeah, exactly. We see ourselves as being perfect, and
that's the plank that's in our eye.
It is.
Because we're putting ourselves up saying, I'm the perfect example, and
Yeah.
that person's not doing like I do, and so they're not, they need to be doing better.
That's exactly right. How many of you here this morning could raise your hand and say that you're perfect? you know, we're not going to do that. We know that we're not perfect, but isn't it strange that if we're not careful, we get sucked into real quick, putting ourselves in a position as an imperfect person, judging other imperfect people. Now, when I say that, it sounds like a strange paradox, doesn't it? Well, this is what Jesus is getting after. Now, the one that Nancy raised about motives, this is really critical. How many times have you caught yourself judging somebody's motive only to find out later that you were completely wrong? And it's like you have, what's the phrase? You get egg on the face. Because I thought I told this Wednesday night. Did I tell this one here about when I went over to Kingston to speak a couple weeks ago? I told it in this class, didn't I? For those of you who weren't here, a couple weeks ago on Wednesday night, I went down to Kingston to speak. I had a great time. Sitting in the back was a gentleman who the whole time that I was speaking, he folded his arms like this, and he had a terrible frown. So I'm thinking, oh boy, okay. I've said some stuff that he really doesn't like, and I'm going to get it when I get through. So I was kind of preparing myself. And I noticed when everything was over, he was standing outside on the front steps. And I had this terrible fleeting thought, you know, I could avoid him by going out the side door. Like, no, I can't do that. So I went out to the front steps, introduced myself, and he shook my hand, and a great big old smile lit up on his face. And he said, that was the most awesome lesson I've heard in a long time. I said, really? Well, and we had been talking about the scene in the Garden of Gethsemane about the Roman legions coming to arrest Jesus. Well, this guy has spent apparently a lifetime studying Roman history. And he, as we were talking on the front steps, he provided a whole bunch of details of stuff that I didn't know about Roman legions. It was fascinating. And so I went home with all this extra information in my head it was really cool. But what was even worse, I kept beating myself up, and I heard the voice of the Lord said, see, you cannot judge by appearance. I said, okay, Lord, I'm guilty. Please forgive me. And it's just so amazing how quickly we base our judgments and conclusions about other people only on what we see. Whew. Of course, none of the rest of you have done that, so I guess I'm the only one guilty, but wow, kind of drove home again. And so with the motives, see, you don't know people's motives. We do not know why people do what they do. Now, you can guess, and what we think we're good at is guessing. And a lot of times when we guess, we base it on two things. What we generally have seen among people through the years and what we generally think we know about that person. So we pull those two together and we draw conclusions on them, okay? We can be wrong. And we don't know why people do things unless they tell us.
The publican and the sinner, when they were praying,
yes.
When the publican was saying, I thank you that I'm not like all these other people.
Yes.
That I do this and I do that and I don't do this and I don't do that. And I think this is a measure of judgment.
It is. It very much is. So we can use external criteria to measure people. It's unfortunate sometimes. We will use criteria that we need to be careful with. Sometimes if we're not careful, we can judge people just on something as simple as how much education they got. And Christians should never be involved in that. Or what side of the tracks you grew up on. I'm sorry, that's not part of the Christian life. It has nothing to do with kingdom view. And as long as we keep that in our brain, we're not being a disciple. We need to hear Jesus on this. I know it's tough. We have to admit it's tough, but just because it's hard doesn't mean we forget it. This gets right at the core of being a disciple. It's not our place to see if people measure up to worldly standards or not. It's not part of the kingdom. And disciples, certainly, are never engaged in measuring each other. It's not my place to measure you. No, not at all. Nancy?
When you look at a person, you should see them as an iceberg. You only see a teeny bit above the surface. There is so much in every person's life that we know nothing about.
That's exactly right.
So very much hurt, so very much pain and past baggage they carry.
That's a great example. The example of an iceberg. When you see an iceberg, what you see above the sea level is just a little bit of what's way down beneath, okay? Now here's another thing too. It's always been strange to me, and I'm going to throw it out. We've all been guilty of this. Think about when you make a mistake, and your first thought is, I hope people give me a lot of leeway here. I didn't know such and such. I tried, but it didn't turn out like I thought. I made a mistake here. And so when we commit that, our immediate thought is, I hope everybody around me is going to give me a ton of leeway on this. How come we want it so bad, but we don't offer it so easily? That's the strange thing to me. The very thing that we deeply desire from others, we're resistant in offering. Boy, we human beings are a strange lot, aren't we? And so the grace that we hope we're going to get from other people, oh man, we've got to learn to offer it and extend it. Otherwise, we fall under the word that Jesus uses, and we need to see him pointing his finger in our face, you hypocrite. Wow. This is a tough lesson, I know it. The Sermon on the Mount would have read so much easier if Jesus had just left this out. You know, if he could have just said, okay, I'm not going to deal with that. He knows he has to deal with it. Because what had happened, remember we talked earlier about religion during Jesus' day and some of the characteristics, and that made a whole lesson. One of the side effects, actually one of the main sort of consequences of it, the rigid religion of his day became so judgmental that it didn't really represent anything God was after. And when Jesus gets right to the heart of things, that's why they can't stand him. That's why early on in his ministry, they're so angry at him, they're already plotting to kill him. Because he gets at the heart of it all. Whew. Probably our early morning prayer needs to include, Lord, please keep me from judging today, because the temptation is going to be everywhere I look. So please help me, because left to my own devices, I'm in trouble. So what is judging all about? It means you pass unfavorable conclusions upon other people. You express an opinion based upon your own limited knowledge. And the problem here is, when you do that, you think you know it all, but you don't. And we criticize, we find fault with, and we can condemn, impose our own ideas without finding out what the real truth is about what's going on. We don't listen enough. The person that judges and condemns is not a good listener. You can just count that to start off with. And it means to assign motives. This is what Nancy's talking about. Without really knowing why a person did such and such. We don't care enough to take time to find out. Turn to 1 Corinthians 4, 1 through 5. Our time is running away. I may have to continue this next week because there's so much good stuff that we need to cover on this. And the Bible actually talks more about this than what we're comfortable with. It's a huge issue, all in Scripture. 1 Corinthians chapter 4. This then is how you ought to regard us. How he starts off. Paul knows that there are some people in Corinth, the Corinthian church, that are not looking at them the way they ought to. This then is how you ought to regard us. As servants of Christ and as those entrusted with the mysteries God has revealed. Now, it is required that those who have been given a trust must prove faithful. I care very little if I'm judged by you or by any human court. What is that? Okay. I hope it's not me. I think I turned mine off. Okay. I care very little if I'm judged by you or by any human court. Indeed, I do not even judge myself. My conscience is clear, but that does not make me innocent. It is the Lord who judges me. Therefore, judge nothing before the appointed time. Wait till the Lord comes. He will bring to light what is hidden in darkness and will expose the motives of the heart. At that time, each will receive their praise from God. Exposing motives is God's work. We just need to leave that to God. We need to recognize that it is the Lord that judges, and He's going to judge each one of us. There's a fascinating thing in the book of Acts that I became aware of a few years ago, and it's messing with my head because Luke's the only one that uses this. And it's like a hyphenated definition of who God is. Twice in the book of Acts, God is called the heart knower. And in English, it gets translated the God who knows all hearts. But literally, God is the heart knower. And it's twice in Acts. And I'm wondering, I'm going to throw this out as a possibility, I'm wondering if what Luke is trying to say by that is that when the early preaching of the gospel began at Jerusalem and then went through Judea, Samaria, into all parts of the earth, I'm wondering if one of the fundamental messages that was preached and proclaimed about God is that this God who made heaven and earth is a God also who knows your heart. And the good news is this, and I want you to think about that. To me, this is the implication of the book of Acts. The good news is God made you, He knows your heart, and boy does He love you. Wow. Because sometimes I hear people say things like, boy, if God only knew my heart. I'm like, okay, now wait a minute. Back the truck up. What do you mean if God only knew your heart? He does know your heart. He's the heart knower. He made you. Of course He knows your heart. And for Christians, that's good news. Because what that means is you don't have to continually think you're living a life hiding from God. What it means is you're living openly and freely before the God who made you, knows you, and loves you. And it's God's job then, who knows the heart. He'll do the judging, motives. That's not our place. We just need to quit that. Oh, time is up. Let's continue this next week because I think it's such a critical lesson that we as Christians need to keep on hearing and keep on reminding each other. We're not in the judging business. We're just not. Thank you all for being here this morning.